Okay, so I was wanting to do like Matt Fraction's run of Iron Man that starts with Believe and goes through like the secret origin of Tony Stark and like the introduction of Arno Stark and different things like that. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that a lot of that comes out of Avengers versus X-Men. And then the more I thought about Avengers versus X-Men, the more I realized that a lot of stuff comes out of Avengers versus X-Men. Really everything that leads up to like Secret Wars really comes out of Avengers versus X-Men. A lot of the stories with characters that are just kind of, wrapping up or, loose ends, different things like that. But even within the story of Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers. For example, the animosity between Black Panther and Namor the Submariner is rooted in Avengers versus X-Men. And so because of that, I was like, well, I mean, it's 12 issues. We can just do it in 2 videos and then just call it a day. So I figured, why not do Avengers versus X-Men? It's called Avengers versus X-Men. So here's the deal. Really, a lot of this winds back all the way to House of M. Ego Raptor, if you see this video, hopefully this helps. For those of you guys who don't know, Ego Raptor, who's part of Game Grumps, had a big question about what to read after House of M with regards to the X-Men, and Marvel did not make it easy. I mean, they released like 7 different X-Men publications. It was stupid. But following the events of House of M, that story in and of itself was just designed for the purpose of really kind of reducing the mutant population. But what Marvel had under their belt after that were just like a litany of different stories that writers were creating. And all of this led up to Avengers Avengers versus X-Men. And so there's like 4 main things, really, with regards to the X-Men themselves, because they're the main focus here. There's like 4 main things that come out of this story. The first is Cyclops, the second is Charles Xavier, the third is the mutant population, and the fourth is Hope Summers. So starting with Hope, she's really kind of like the big picture character here. After House of M, the mutant population was down to like 198, and it was really designed for the purpose of just kind of offering some measure of a clean slate, which is to say the mutant population had grown to be so huge and so unruly that editor-in-chief Joe Quesada was like, let's just reduce it down to an almost minuscule number and then just kind of start over, focus on the core X-Men that we have, and then just kind of grow it organically from there. The problem is that there were so many events going on that Marvel never really had a chance to sit down and let the X-Men breathe. Instead, we got House of M, and then we were immediately followed by Civil War, where the X-Men were just hands off, and then we were immediately followed by Secret Invasion, and then Dark Reign, and then Siege, and then Fear itself, and there were just all these stories that were going on that Marvel never really had a chance to let the X-Men breathe properly because they had to constantly roll them over into these stories. And so no one could sit down and really do any great storytelling with the X-Men themselves, but there were a handful of stories that are important. There's really only 3 that are really significant with the character of Hope Summers. The first is Messiah Complex, the second is Messiah War, and the third is Second Coming. And with these 3 stories, what they did is they basically introduced the character of Hope. And Marvel had kind of teased this idea of, well, Hope Summers, she might be the next Jean Grey, that kind of thing. But the idea was that she would be the host of the Phoenix Force. But regardless of whether she was the host or not, she was going to be the way in which the new birth of mutants began to crop up. The problem is that never really happened. Marvel didn't do anything with her character. She just kind of sat on the back burner for years and years and years and years, and it got to the point that by the time Avengers versus X-Men came around, people were just like, why is Hope Summers still here? Now, with regards to Cyclops, his character had become more and more extreme over the years, and the reason why was because, again, coming out of House of M, Charles Xavier was gone. Nobody knew where he went to. The Scarlet Witch said no more mutants, reality returned to a state of normalcy, minus the mutant population, being as large as it was, and Charles Xavier had vanished. And so in his absence, Cyclops and Emma Frost took over control of the X-Men. Now, Professor X did come back in a story called X-Men Deadly Genesis, and that introduced like Vulcan, the third Summers brother, so on and so forth. But it introduced a lot of the actions that Charles Xavier had done that he had kept hidden over the years. And the result was that Cyclops and Emma Frost more or less lost faith in him. And so they literally would not allow him to be leader of the X-Men. Instead, they took over and they said, you can be an advisor, and that's it. And so Xavier just kind of sat on the back burner, and that was really it. And again, the other part of this being the mutant population, with it being so small, the idea was to bring it back somewhere along the line to begin regrowing, or I guess, restoring the mutant population. And so with Avengers versus X-Men, this really does a lot of that, especially once we get to the end, with regards to Charles Xavier, the Phoenix Force, that kind of a thing. But the crazy thing about this is that the arrival of the Phoenix Force, it really comes with the arrival of Nova, of Sam Alexander. Now, the crazy thing about this is, I want to say there was a Marvel Infinite comic, which is basically like their digital only series. And it was really just like Sam Alexander trying to outrun the Phoenix Force as it was making its way back to Earth in order to warn the Avengers, really the superhero community, of what was going to happen. And ultimately nobody could really, he wasn't able to make it in time, and the Phoenix more or less just kind of makes its presence known. Now, with regards to like Tony Stark and Captain America becoming aware of the fact that the Phoenix is returning, this is huge. And the reason why is because in the eyes of them, as well as virtually anybody else who was there when Jean Grey was the Phoenix, their first thought is whoever the host of the Phoenix Force is going to go awry. Now, through their own studies, through their involvement with the X-Men and so on, they know the host of the Phoenix is going to be Hope Summers. And therein lies the crux of Avengers versus X-Men. It's really just a battle for Hope Summers. It's making her as important as she's ever going to be in the line of Marvel Comics. But with regards to their stance on the Phoenix, for those of you guys who aren't really familiar with this idea in Marvel Comics, the way it originally played out is that Jean Grey was a character that just no one really cared about in the original X-Men comics. She was quite literally the quintessential damsel in distress. She could never, get through training sessions on her own. Cyclops always had to rescue her. The team always had to step in to save her life because she just never do anything worthwhile. When Chris Claremont took over the X-Men, he was like, that depiction of that character sucks. We're gonna make her cool. And so because of that, they introduced the Phoenix Force. Jean Grey became the Phoenix, which gave her just these godlike powers. But the idea was the longer the Phoenix posed as Jean Grey, the more the Phoenix began to experience emotions, anger, rage, love, all that kind of good stuff. And so because of that, the Phoenix became corrupted by emotion, and in doing so, became the Dark Phoenix. And so because she was the Dark Phoenix, Jean, or I guess the Phoenix posing as Jean, presented a credible threat to not just Earth, but the universe as a whole. Because remember, the Phoenix Force represents the sum total of all life that has and will ever exist in the Marvel multiverse. Not just the universe, but the multiverse. There's only one Phoenix Force throughout the multiverse. The Phoenix Force will have avatars, like the Phoenix can break itself off into pieces, and then one piece can appear in the Ultimate Universe, and one piece can appear in the main Marvel universe, and one piece can appear in another universe, and different things like that. But there's only ever one Phoenix Force. And so because of this, with Hope being so young and being so inexperienced, the initial concern of Captain America and the Avengers is that if the Phoenix takes over her, she's going to become the Dark Phoenix. It'll be the whole Jean Grey saga all over again, and it's going to lead to absolute pandemonium. Now, the other half of this equation is Cyclops himself. Now, of course, Cyclops here, when the Avengers show up and the Avengers confront him, it's really kind of a funny scenario because on the whole, it's just the X-Men against the Avengers, and really in the initial skirmish of all this. And once we actually get to about the midway point is when things start to change. But notice here, you have guys like Magneto, you have guys like Namor the Submariner. The reason why they're here is because of the fact that during the events of Dark Reign, which followed Secret Invasion, when Tony Stark was kicked out as director of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Norman Osborn was put in his place, Norman Osborn started implementing a campaign of world domination, or really kind of dominating the United States and then intending to dominate the world. But he created groups like the Dark Avengers, like the Dark X-Men, different things like that, which were basically villainous versions of popular superhero teams. But the idea was that the X-Men would not play ball with Norman Osborn. And because Norman only had control of the continental United States, they left the continental United States and went to an island they called Utopia. And so because of this, the X-Men were joined by Namor the Submariner, who is part mutant and rallied himself to his cause, alongside Magneto and a handful of others who just saw Cyclops as a legitimate leader of the X-Men, and were basically just kind of banding together because there were so few of them left. It's really just circumstance that kind of brought them all together. But the fact remains here, that's the reason why they're here. But with the X-Men showing up, Cyclops' stance is that there's only 200 of them left, and Hope Summers may be the key to returning the mutant population back to where it should be. That is to say, a whole new birth of mutants across the world. And so in Cyclops' mind, he's not the bad guy here. And that's the crazy thing. He's the good guy fighting on behalf of mutants who have yet to be born, who have yet to gain their powers, to have their X genes activated or their X genes given to them and then activated. And so, of course, this leads to the most logical scenario when the Avengers and the X-Men just start fighting one another. Now, in truth, there's really not a lot to be had here in terms of discussion. I mean, it's kind of cool to see, these guys going against one another, but the ultimate goal is to get Hope Summers out of there, to get Hope Summers to a different location so that she can be held safe away from the prying eyes of the Avengers themselves and the safety of the X-Men. But this is really Marvel just kind of showcasing the different abilities of the people who are here. I mean, the abilities of Spider-Man going against some of the X-Men, so on and so forth. But it's also the idea that certain people have to choose sides, namely Wolverine. Because remember, following the Avengers disassembled story, Wolverine was rolled over into the new Avengers team as it was formed by Captain America, Iron Man, alongside Spider-Man and a handful of others. And so at this particular point in his character's chronology, because this takes place before the death of Wolverine, he serves as both an Avenger and an X-Man. And so he's just kind of having to pick a side. Now, the funny thing about this is that Marvel plays it pretty fast and loose with his character and has him walk both lines. The closer the Phoenix Force gets to Earth, the more in tune Hope Summers becomes with the Phoenix Force's power. And so in a lot of ways, Wolverine, having been in love with Jean Grey, sees very much of her in Hope Summers, especially the kind of power she possesses, the emotions weapons she displays, that they get the better of her from time to time. And so where Hope Summers basically just kind of incapacitates everyone who's guarding her and races off, the other half of this is that another Avengers team has been sent into space in order to try to confront and stop the Phoenix Force before it gets to Earth. Now again, this is an impossible task. The Phoenix Force is just wildly powerful. It's way too strong. In fact, the Phoenix Force is so powerful that Marvel has yet to define an actual power set for the Phoenix. The Phoenix just has the ability to do whatever the host wants to do at any particular point in time. That's basically the power of the Phoenix. I mean, the only real description we have was given to us in Grant Morrison's New X-Men, I think it was. New X-Men, where it was just like the Phoenix just heals universes or just like fixes problems, quote unquote. That's all it does. Like, it just does whatever it needs to do. And so it just has omniversal power. It's insane what it is that it's capable of. And so the idea of the Avengers trying to stop it is absolute nonsense. But at the end of the day, where Hope Summers basically goes on the run, Wolverine actually catches up to her and serves the purpose of essentially helping her achieve her goal, which is to get to the moon and then in turn access the Phoenix Force. Now again, the funny thing about this is the idea that Wolverine's kind of picking and choosing his allegiances. I mean, this initially came out of a fight between him and Captain America, you know, where Captain America is beating the absolute hell out of Wolverine, Wolverine's beating the absolute hell out of Captain America. It's kind of ironic this is a pretty close fight because you wouldn't expect it to be, especially with, you know, Wolverine's training in all these different forms of martial arts. And so because of that, it's kind of funny to see this event unfold. But when Wolverine's effectively cast out, he tracks down Hope Summers and then helps her to get to the moon. Now, of course, with regards to this fight against the Phoenix, it's really like this last man standing with Thor. Thor is really like the last of the Avengers in space. Now, the other Avengers aren't dead. I mean, they're very much alive. It's just they can't fight anymore because they've more or less been incapacitated. But the funny thing about this is that it's Marvel showing us where the Phoenix Force stands in relation to a lot of the heroes that are out there. Because remember, for a lot of people, Avengers versus X-Men was their first exposure to the Phoenix Force. They'd never read like Phoenix Endsong, you know, they'd never read any of the Jean Grey saga under Chris Claremont. I mean, they never read any of that stuff. They've read about it online, but they never actually read the stories. And so because of that, seeing the Phoenix in full force is kind of interesting. But something that I want to point out here is that as far as this story goes, Matt Fraction had really kind of like nerfed the Phoenix. Like, he'd made it pretty weak in comparison to how it's actually supposed to be. I mean, you're talking about a multiversal force of pure omnipotence. I mean, it is virtually unstoppable. And so the kind of things that we'll see playing out here is kind of ironic because a person in full capacity of the Phoenix Force, which is to say the White Phoenix of the Crown, can warp reality on a universal and multiversal scale. They can just reform anything as they want it to be, which kind of begs the question, where does a Phoenix reside in terms of all the powerful entities that are out there? And that's a video for another time. We did that once before, but we kind of have to change things up since new characters have been introduced and different things like that. But the fact remains here that with regards to the Avengers trying to track down Hope Summers, trying to find her location, all of them basically deduce the fact that she's heading to the moon, you know, where Wolverine's basically helping her get to an advanced idea mechanics tech station and then basically use a shuttle in order to get to the moon. Once they get there, this is kind of like this major conflict, this final battle that takes place. And the crazy thing about this is that it's like this last stand at the Alamo. It's this last attempt to try to end the Phoenix. Now, the other half of this is Tony Stark himself. Now, once we get into Iron Man Believe, Matt Fraction's run, this is the point that they're basically talking about when it comes to his actions in destroying the Phoenix. This is really kind of what the what that race, I can't remember what they were called, but what that race is referring to. Stark basically manufactures or develops a massive suit designed for the purpose of effectively destroying the Phoenix Force's life entity. But even then, that's why I say the Phoenix Force is so powerful, because it just represents life. And so in truth, in order for the Phoenix Force to truly be destroyed, you would have to wipe out all things in existence. I mean, literally just like wipe out the entirety of the multiverse with not a single scrap of energy left. Because if there's a single iota of energy, that energy will become space, and then it'll become stars, which in turn will form planets, which will grow life, and the Phoenix Force will exist. And so because of that, you'd literally have to wipe out all things in existence, which can't really happen. And so because of that, with the Phoenix Force finally emerging on the moon and making its presence known to Hope Summers, the initial idea is that if it seizes control of her again, it'll send her into a state of chaos because she's not emotionally ready to harness the full power of the Phoenix. Not even Jean Grey was, and she was a full-grown woman. Now, of course, as time progressed with Jean's character, she was able to kind of harness the Phoenix, but she was nowhere near as powerful as she was during the original Phoenix saga. It was more or less like the Phoenix power would just manifest occasionally, but it was reduced in strength by quite a bit. And so with Tony Stark basically attacking this Phoenix, ultimately what it ends up doing is instead of destroying the Phoenix Force, it splits its energy into 5 pieces, which go into Namor the Submariner, Emma Frost, Cyclops, Colossus, and Magic, Illyana Rasputin, a Colossus' little sister. Now, why these these particular 5 were chosen, I have not been able to find an interview that gives any real measure of explanation. It's just, they were the ones who were just there. I mean, it's just really done for the sake of storytelling. But the cool thing about this is it begs the question of how bad are their motives? Are their motives really that bad in the first place? Because what we end up doing is we actually pick up 10 days after the Phoenix Five are basically formed, and we travel to the island of Utopia. Now, what the Phoenix Five have basically done is to use their powers to transform Utopia into this Utopia place. Now, that's kind of the irony of it, is because of the fact that with the namesake of Utopia, when it was originally formed by the X-Men, it was basically a utopia of sorts that was designed to be kind of like a modern day version of Genosha. And what I mean here, I know we're covering a lot of X-Men history here, so bear with me, but Genosha was basically this place that existed for the purpose of being Magneto's own little home away from home. It was Magneto's place to basically have a location where mutants could be free from human oppression. It was a country that was governed by mutants that was only for mutants. Now, mutants could live elsewhere in the world if they wanted to, but it was just one of those things where you pay your money and take your chances. You live in New York, folks are gonna hate you because you're a mutant. If you live in San Francisco, they're gonna hate you because you're a mutant. If you live in Genosha, you're gonna live among your own kind. Now, there's a whole backstory in terms of why Magneto got Genosha in the first place and that kind of thing, but Genosha itself was destroyed in the first story arc of Grant Morrison's new X-Men that was basically called E is for Extinction. And so because of that, Genosha was just this wasteland. And so if you read like House of M or really any of the modern X-Men stories before All New, All Different Marvel, and you basically go and they show you the city of Genosha, that's why it's destroyed. It was just never rebuilt. Instead of rebuilding it during the whole Dark Reign story, Marvel just introduced Utopia, and it was just like Cyclops' version of Genosha, more or less. It was a safe haven for what was left of the X-Men. Now, the fact remains here that Charles Xavier is effectively brought into the equation, and this is one of the most important parts of the story, and the reason why is because of the fact that Cyclops is the first and oldest student of Charles Xavier, not necessarily in age, but he's the oldest in terms of the people who have been part of Charles Xavier's life the longest. He was the first student. He's the one that really shared so many of Xavier's ideologies, and that's one of the reasons why there were some people that loved Avengers versus X-Men, and there were some that hated Avengers versus X-Men. Now, we'll get a little more into that discussion once we get into the death of Charles Xavier, but the idea here is that what Cyclops basically says is, your dream of a peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants is exactly what I'm bringing to you. Like, you've always wanted to see humans and mutants existing. You've always wanted to see the world to be basically this giant utopia. That's exactly what we're doing here. Now, the problem with this is that Cyclops is doing this at the edge of a gun. He's doing this with a weapon. He's basically pointing a gun at the heads of everybody and saying, if you don't do what I tell you to, I'm gonna pull the trigger. And so it's not really like a utopia so much as it is just like an enlightened monarch or an enlightened dictatorship. The funny thing about this is that Hope Summers is being kept on the island itself. And Hope's, I guess, really her kind of offering to be here is really more of like, hey, you can be here if you want to, but you can leave anytime you want. Now, we're gonna find out it's actually one of those fake scenarios where she's really not allowed to leave. But again, this really just kind of shows the stance of Cyclops, because what he does is he approaches her and says, hey, look, the power of the Phoenix Force is so seductive. If I were to offer it to you, what would be your answer? And of course, she says yes. Now, of course, Cyclops yanks away and says, but you're not ready for it. And this is the contradictory nature of his character. With absolute power, or at least as they say, absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's exactly what's going on with Cyclops right now, as well as the other Phoenix Five. They're being overcome by the power they possess. And it makes sense because it's like a drug. I mean, imagine for example, tomorrow you woke up and realized that you could warp reality, that with enough time, you could train yourself to do that. So you could go to like Best Buy and you could reach into your pocket and have as much money as you needed at that particular point in time. Or you could just not even need money. You could just say, you know what, I want a big 4K TV, and you just manifest it out of thin air. Imagine you had that kind of godlike power. Would you be willing to give it up? Would you be willing to let it go? Of course not. I mean, because you would genuinely believe, well, I can keep it contained. I can keep it controlled. I can keep it from allowing the world to run amok, but you can't see the future. You don't know what's going to happen. And it may very well lead to the destruction of yourself and everything that you hold dear. And that's really what's kind of being played here with regards to Cyclops, is he's losing himself in the power that he possesses. And that's why it's so extreme. That's why it's so intense, is because of the fact that Cyclops himself was, again, the oldest student of Charles Xavier. He followed Charles Xavier's ideology of a peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants in the extreme. He was the one champion, the one guy that Xavier could always count on to uphold his ideologies. With Cyclops falling so far so fast, it's this idea that he's almost reaching the point that he's beyond hope. Now, he will reach that place. He will reach that level that he's basically beyond any real measure of redemption. But what we end up doing here is we pick up with the Avengers, because again, their goal is to grab Hope Summers, and their goal is to get her out of there, because the stance of Cyclops and the other Phoenix, I guess the other members of the Phoenix Five is they're going to keep Hope Summers on Utopia. They're going to train her on how to use her powers effectively so that when the time comes, they will imbue her with the Phoenix Force and she will become the new Phoenix, and she'll basically be a harbinger of the rebirth of mutants across the earth. Well, again, from the Avengers standpoint, it's only a matter of time before she becomes corrupted by that power. And so what they do is they basically initiate a halo jump. Now, halo jumps are kind of cool. They seem kind of interesting. I've never served in the military, so I've never done one before, and I never would. But halo stands for high altitude, low open. And what that means is you usually jump from like 30,000 feet. But the idea is to jump from an extremely high altitude and then open at the very moment before you hit the bottom, relatively speaking, so that no one knows you're there. And that's the idea to pull off here. Now, under normal circumstances, from what I understand, with a halo jump, you usually attach flares to yourself, somewhere on your body, like a foot or hand or something like that, so people know where you are. But in this instance, they're not doing that, because if they did, anybody in Utopia would look up and say, hey, what are those flares doing falling from the sky? And they would realize the Avengers are coming. And so the funny thing about this is that it's also the Avengers not really underestimating, but just taking their chances as best they can, because Emma Frost is one of the Phoenix Five. She's an Omega level telepath. She's wildly powerful in her telepathic abilities. You know, with the Phoenix powers, she can read the minds of everyone on Earth at the same time without being phased in any form or fashion. And so she knows the Avengers are coming. She knows they're on their way. But something that I want you to notice here is how manipulative she's going to become. That's something I want you to keep in the back of your head, because she's going to become a very significant and violent character. But ultimately, with Cyclops and Emma Frost making their presence, they essentially just kind of show up to confront the Avengers, but then the Avengers are met with the arrival of the Scarlet Witch. Now, this is basically Marvel just kind of reminding us, hey, look, the Scarlet Witch is still pretty powerful, but it's more so fear than it is legitimate power. The Scarlet Witch is more powerful as herself. She's more powerful than any one member of the Phoenix Five. But the Phoenix Five are terrified of the Scarlet Witch because, remember, she's the one that said no more mutants and stripped everybody of their powers. And so from their perspective, she's terrifying. You know, her power is extreme, and she could warp reality in such a degree that she can just remove mutant powers from everyone. Then what could she do against the Phoenix? Now, the important thing to keep in mind here is that the Scarlet Witch has been reduced in power. She's not House of M powerful anymore. That was a moment in time. That was it. That was the absolute peak and height of her powers. At this point, she's still pretty strong in terms of what she can do, but against the entirety of the Phoenix Force combined into one, she doesn't stand a chance. Like, she's just not that powerful. You know, really no one is. And so what we end up doing here is, of course, with the Scarlet Witch effectively whisking Hope Summers away and allying herself with the Avengers, what this does is it begins drawing lines in the sand. And this is Marvel effectively prepping the second part of the story, which is when a lot of the X-Men begin to defect away from the Phoenix Five because of the aggressive and the intense actions that they begin to take towards the globe and everybody in it as a whole. But with that being said, guys, we are going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.